focus almost entirely on local issues. So um, that is, as I mentioned before, the sustainability issues in Knoxville have been big. The previous mayor and the current mayor both have been actually the past four mayors have been committed to reducing carbon emissions. And that was a big issue in last year's municipal election. We had several council races and the mayor's race last year, and the new um, goals are quite ambitious. So they want to reduce cities' emissions by 50% over 2005 levels by 2030 and 80% citywide overall emissions by 2050 by 80%. So we cover developments along those lines. And we also cover TVA, some in some of their efforts, especially in conjunction with the Knoxville Utilities Boards, the largest supplier of energy here in Knox County. And we cover a lot of their goals. And we also cover Oak Ridge National Laboratory and some of the advances that they make there. Although Oak Ridge National Laboratory is not in our actual coverage area, a lot of people in Knox County work there and are heavily invested in what's going on there. So you're absolutely right. The way that we address climate change is through how it affects us locally.
I think along the lines of what Scott just mentioned, our focus tends to be on how local individuals and institutions are coping with the challenges that climate change presents. Oak Ridge, TVA, local government, those all tend to be focal points. In the past year at Knox News, I've built a strong relationship with Inside Climate News through a connection that I have with a reporter there, Jim Bruggers, who I worked with in Louisville, and he covers the South region for Inside Climate News. And we've collaborated on a number of pieces that take a wider view as well, so that we're not so tightly focused just on Knoxville itself. And I think that's, one of the challenges, I think Scott will tell you, David will tell you about covering climate change, is it's such an enormous issue. And to connect it to people on the local level takes a lot of thought, and making it relevant to their lives can be challenging at times. So, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can bring it home to people in a meaningful way that directly impacts their lives.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to hear that you're working with Inside Climate News. Their coverage is fantastic. They do so much good partnership work.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great. Okay, well, so if that's our baseline, how has this, your coverage of climate change changed or evolved in the context of the pandemic? David, you started to touch on this a little bit, said that it's continues to come up. I'd love to hear from everybody.
Sure. One of in the context that's been most important for me, and I think for us as a network, has been fighting misinformation, and that already has been an issue even pre-pandemic. And so trying to get people accurate information about whether it's climate change or whether healthcare solutions, the state of a vaccine, those kinds of things are going to be really important. In the context of climate change, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is, and I talked about environmental justice a little bit, is those things that we're leaving untreated because hospitals are so focused on COVID right now. What are the situations related to air quality, or water quality that need to be dealt with, especially at a time when a lot of these regulations are being repealed or proposed to be repealed, and this is part of that overall discussion. I think one of the things that really spooked a lot of people was the price of the Green New Deal, or the price tag on it, because you're talking about in the trillions of dollars. Yet we just passed trillions of dollars in aid for COVID relief just a few months ago, and there's talk for more of that. And the question is, how do you combine those two? Because this issue is definitely not going away. Even though there were some reports early on that we saw pollution levels lower compared to past years because there wasn't as much driving, there's still that great demand to get from point A to point B. And we just have to keep up that information and making sure that it's accurate information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a good point that the one thing the pandemic has changed is, I think, our scale of the possible government response to something like climate change. Like, now we can imagine a whole lot that before seemed maybe tough. And one thing that is particularly relevant to CCL is that early on in the pandemic, the government sent direct cash payments to people, and that's something that we're advocating for as a climate solution, is to put a price on carbon and give a cash dividend to people every month. And so that's another way that we saw something become even more tangible, even more possible in the context of this issue.
I think you bring up a good point there, Flannery, about it's opened your eyes to the possibilities of what we can do when we put our collective will to it. The other side of that coin, the negative side of it, is something we talk about all the time in journalism, which is don't let the urgent push out the important. And a crisis like the COVID crisis is so immediate and so in your face that there's no way that you can't react to it, right? And as we all know, this isn't some great insight. When you have a slow-moving, long-developing crisis, it's so much harder to get people to focus on that. And in some sense, COVID's been great because it's great that you all know what I mean when I say that. It's been instructive because it shows you the possibilities, but it's also so all-consuming that it's taken a tremendous amount of attention of journalists and activists across the country in a way that you do fear that the eye is off the ball in some sense.
Yeah, I agree with Joe, especially about it's sucked all the air out of the room. The pandemic has really been much more immediate. As Joel mentioned, climate change is a slow developing story that can be very technical, very complex, and it's not something that's going to kill you in 4 weeks like COVID-19 can. So the other thing that this has done is it shows, and this is a bad thing for journalism. I mean, Compass is a two-person shop. There are two of us who do all the reporting, all the editing, and everything else. So we have to be very, there are limits on what we can cover. And newsrooms all over the country have faced this. The News Sentinel's newsroom is about half the size it was when I was the environmental reporter there. We had 3 reporters who basically covered the environment, or at least chunks of their beat involved the environment. And with fewer resources, it's just a lot more difficult to get to all these stories, especially when there are major immediate stories that do just command your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious about, that's a little bit about your coverage. I'm curious about the response to your coverage. Do you guys hear things back from your readers about when you talk about climate, when you cover climate? Do you get feedback? Do you get interaction on social media? Or if you don't, is that something that you would like or that would be helpful? Because we're all advocates out there in the community and want to be able to encourage media to cover climate more and that sort of thing. And so I'd be curious to hear about that kind of feedback loop, if there is one, or if, what we could do to improve it.
Like I say, from the opinion side, the conversation has changed quite a bit over the last decade, in my experience. You used to have more people who thought this was a hoax. That's less so these days. You see more people accepting the science more. They may not agree on the solutions, but they're cognizant that something is happening and that something needs to be done about it. They're not talking about it. They're not conflating weather and climate like they used to, in my experience. And so that's a positive development as well, I think, as there's been more education and even, the conversation that has become a bipartisan issue to a degree. And in fact, one of the things that was a tragedy back in 2008 is that prior to that, there were many Republicans, including Arnold Schwarzenegger, Charlie Crist, who was governor of Florida at the time, who were bringing people to the table from the energy sector and the environmental sector to sit down and set goals. And that whole drill baby drill conversation during the 2008 election was devastating. And I think it set back a lot of things because people started to believe that in fact it was an either or choice. It's like either you drill or you have solar energy, for example. And I think today there's the issue of cost and the fact that we're seeing success, for example, in windmills in Iowa of all places. You know, that's been something that also has opened the eyes that this in fact affects us too. When we look at a state like Tennessee, the temperatures are getting warmer. It's affecting the types of mosquitoes that we have. When you talk about it from that micro level, it makes a difference when it comes to, you know, mosquito-borne illnesses, those kinds of things. And talking about it in a way, I think, you know, from my standpoint, I do a lot of conversations that are more civil and kind, and it can be very difficult because you do have to have a lot of patience because the science is tough. And but I'm seeing it go in a positive direction.
Yeah, I think David's absolutely right. It feels like we've cleared the hurdle of having to talk about whether it's happening or not, right? But I think the partisanship that's developed around the issue is deeply concerning. I mean, anyone, like most of you, all of you, I'm sure on this call, understand that it wasn't that long ago that this was not a partisan issue. I mean, within very recent memory. So, you know, I think when you look at how coverage of this needs to be framed, and I think for those of you who are activists, when you're thinking about what approaches, I've noticed a couple of questions here is, you know, how can we write op-eds in a way that are effective with connecting with people? Stepping out of that partisan arena is a really good way to do it. There are plenty of places where there are common interests, and finding those and building on those are ultimately going to be the way that you bring people into the same solutions mindset rather than attacking. I think there's a tendency in media and in activists to think very black and white on a lot of these issues. So you take, I talk about in Knoxville, you know, TVA is a major player in anything that happens here, right? And a lot of folks tend to cast TVA as either a good guy or a bad guy, when there's a whole lot of gray in that organization. You know, at the same time that it's had a profound effect on energy and energy policy, it's been both good and bad. And there has to be an acknowledgement that that can exist in individuals and organizations, and try to figure out how you shift the needle from what you consider the bad to the good.
Yeah, as far as reader feedback goes, most of the we have a very small niche audience, and we don't do opinion pieces, so it's not as easy. We do a lot. We have social media where we interact with our readers. We haven't had any pushback on what we do. And what we do is you know, this has been settled a long time ago as far as the science goes. In 2004, I believe it was, I went to the Scripps Howard Institute on the Environment at Colorado University for a week of training, and one of my colleagues from who's there from the Chicago Tribune asked one of the researchers we were talking with one day when she could stop trying to find somebody to bring the other side of climate science. And the researcher said, "Now, it's settled, it's done." And you know, that had to. And so what we did when we launched Compass is we just reported as a given, and we haven't had any pushback at all. So as far as getting any angry emails or you know, social media arguments. And one reason that we do, like I said before, most of our coverage is focused on, so far, has focused on the sustainability efforts of the city of Knoxville, and that has broad support. There is not one city council member who disagrees with the need to reduce carbon footprint of the city. The mayor is enthusiastically behind that, and the city does, the bulk of the carbon emissions from the that are created in Knox County are created inside the city limits. So we've really not seen a lot of pushback from the community at all.
Well, that's great to hear. And I do want to stay on that for just a minute, but I'll remind all our audience here that we'll start taking your questions here in a minute. So if you have questions for David or Joel or Scott, please drop those in the chat. And I'll give you a few minutes to get your questions in. But Scott, can you tell us a little bit more about what the city of Knoxville is doing just at the local level? What are they working on specifically?
Well, the biggest thing that they've done, they actually completed this last year, is they converted all their street lights to LEDs. And that has, it's done two things. It's slashed their energy bills. So it's saved taxpayers a lot of money, and it's also reduced energy consumption. And that's been that was the big thing. And that is actually what the original climate goal was to reduce emissions by 20% by 2020 over 2005 levels. They met that in 2019 because of that project. They're using a lot of solar. They retrofitted a lot of buildings, or new buildings, or green buildings. And this is directly the city, but the KUB and TVA have done some weatherization, had made some weatherization funds available. There are programs that are doing that, and so they're actually doing quite a bit. And now, granted, they have they've been focused on COVID-19 like everybody else, so they haven't announced anything major that's coming up on the horizon. But I'm sure that there is work going on about it. They just haven't. Plus, they had a ransomware attack, and they've been hobbled with their computer systems for the last couple of months. So.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's been fun in Knoxville.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that like you said, some of those big projects happened last year. This is a long-term commitment. This is an ongoing thing. That's great. Great to see. Joel or David, any specific local improvements or advancements in this area you want to touch on?
No, I think Scott did a good job of explaining. Here in Knoxville, we're fortunate that we have city government that's been focused on the issue for quite some time, much longer than a lot of communities, including a lot of communities that are considered very, very progressive on the issue. So they're putting their money where their mouth is, and they're setting very transparent goals and ambitious goals for local government. So I think that's a real positive.
The Sunrise Movement has put a lot of pressure on politicians to embrace climate goals, and that has been successful over the last year in the Nashville area, where we have the mayor, John Cooper, and his brother, Jim Cooper, who's also the congressman for the area, both decided to take bold action when it came to climate. But after a lot of activism, for a while, Jim Cooper was not for the Green New Deal. After consulting with Al Gore Jr. and with pressure, he did embrace it. And then over the summer, I believe in July, Mayor John Cooper signed on to the letter by mayors urging Congress for action on climate. And it's interesting how the conversation has shifted, because yes, the environmental issues are very important, but they're also talking about it in terms of jobs, green new jobs, that this is the future. And so they're creating a new type of rhetoric and debate. And that, I think, is driving mayors, regardless of whether they're conservative or liberal, to really push forward, because they do see it as an economic development issue, especially as the pandemic has really harmed economies across the country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, so I want to take a few audience questions now. People have been putting things in the chat. Thank you, everyone. So we have a question from Joanne. She says, how do readers get their local media to cover climate change? Because she says that she's in Clarksville, Tennessee's 5th largest city, and she says, I've made requests and sent articles from other Tennessee news media, but she's getting no response. So do you guys have advice for when folks want to reach out to media outlets, how they can do that effectively to try to ask for more climate coverage or express that as a reader?
Yeah, I'll tackle that one because it's a challenging topic, and I certainly appreciate the frustration for people when they want to see more coverage in a certain area. There's a couple things I would urge you to keep in mind. One, if you're sending coverage that's already been done to another outlet, it's fair enough for them to say this has already been done, right? The media landscape is enormous. It's richer and bigger than it's ever been in our entire history. And you're not limited by the geography of your local outlet the way that you were 25 or 30 years ago, right? So I think it's important to understand the scope and mission of the outlet that you're dealing with. So as a local general interest news outlet, we're never going to provide the same depth and detail of environmental coverage that, say, Inside Climate News is. So I think you have to be realistic about what you expect from the source of your news. That's not to say we won't do detailed and in-depth environmental reporting, but it's not going to undergird every element of our reporting in the same way that an environmentally focused newsroom would. I think it's vitally important to think about what that local link is when you're dealing with local news organizations. And I think it's important to step out of the expert or activist mode once in a while and try to think about when you have those conversations with people who aren't in your world, when do you connect with people? What are the kind of topics or approaches that you have that actually engaged them? And then try to relate that back to coverage when you're having conversations with journalists about, hey, this isn't an article about the environmental movement. It's an article about, say, how taxpayers in the city of Knoxville just saved $2 million a year because they put LED lights on in their street lights, right? It's a different framing of the same issue. And it's very hard to do when you're an expert. I always, to that point, I always think about when you run into people that are still skeptical about the long-term effects of climate change. I always say, it's funny that one of the leading institutions on planning for catastrophic effects from climate change is the U.S. military. That's not a group that's known for, spending a lot of time and effort on things that they don't actually believe are happening and are coming. So I think if you can find sources that kind of blow up convention, that's helpful as well.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick and affirm what Joel just said about the mission of the outlet. As I mentioned before, we're a Knox County outlet. If you want an article on the effects of climate change in the Cumberland Plateau, we're not going to do it. We're not the ones to do that, at least unless there is a way we can work it in. If we've got UT researchers who are doing the research, UT Knoxville researchers are doing the research, then we can work that in. So always think of the outlet and their primary audience, and try to connect it with that outlet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a sort of a follow-up question that is just from me. I'm going to count myself as an audience member right now. How would you respond if someone reached out and said, rather than offering a story idea, just said, hey, I'm a local person that does XYZ job. I also am a climate advocate with this group, and we have professors, we have economists, we have moms in our group, and you can call us if you need a source for if you want to talk to someone for these types of stories, is that something that would be useful?
That's a very, very smart strategy. Creating expert lists and putting them in front of journalists is a fantastic way to make connections with newsrooms. You see universities do it all the time, and some do it really, really well. There are institutions that even go beyond the expert list and pay very close attention to what the news cycle is, and make actually have outreach when there's a story that you may have expertise on, actually reaching out to a news outlet and saying, hey, I know this is in the news right now. Did you know that we have so-and-so who is really knowledgeable about this topic? For instance, the 2019 flooding that we had in Knoxville, right? If you had somebody that was expert in what were some of the causes of that and reached out to our newsroom, I guarantee you we would have taken you up on that.
Got it. Okay, so I'll just give a little plug then to folks on this call. I realize I didn't introduce myself. I'm CCL's communications director, and this is part of what we do is we try to, as advocates, bring climate change and climate solutions into the local media landscape. And so anyone on this call who likes the sound of that might be a good project. Figure out who in your chapter could be an expert source, could offer good quotes and good information to your local reporters, and have those people in mind and connect those dots. David, did you want to share something on that?
Yeah, just as an addition, and I see it in the chat as well, the issue of op-eds or guest columns, we certainly welcome that. And if you have some expertise that you wish to share, we'll definitely consider your op-ed. There was a question of whether or not we do the both and, or whether we need a pro-con. Not necessarily. We want a factual topics that will help lead to a better debate. And if something is erroneous or absolutely wrong or maliciously untrue, we're not going to run it. And so we have over the years have really raised our standards. I actually give a lot of credit to Joel, who has challenged us to raise our standards even more when it comes to op-eds. And but we do welcome voices. One of the most recent op-eds we ran was just yesterday by Lieutenant General John Castellaw, who I believe is speaking at this conference. I think he's being referenced in the chat as well. And the title of his op-ed is "How Tennessee Farmers Are Helping to Fight Climate Change." And he is, to Joel's point, he was retired from the military, from the Marines, and made the point in his op-ed that the military really is concerned about this issue as a national security issue. And in this case, he's talking to the rural communities, because Tennessee is mostly rural, and how to frame it in a way that people will understand and embrace.
Yeah, great points. Okay, one other question from the chat. Dawn is asking just sort of a logistical question about the newsroom. She's wondering, do you have a dedicated climate reporter, or does coverage of the issue get spread out among different beats? So for example, a business reporter who's going to cover rising insurance rates because of climate stuff. How does that work in your newsroom?
We don't have somebody that is their only beat, and very few newsrooms beyond the largest national outlets generally have somebody that only covers environmental topics. It's usually paired, as the question referenced, it's connected to business or local government or activism. And that's certainly the approach that we take. That's not necessarily a negative thing either. I know that it's, if you're keenly interested in the topic, it feels good to see that there's somebody on a staff list that's their area of expertise. But sometimes that coverage can become so narrow that it doesn't reach a wide enough audience. And I think that there are advantages to spreading it across several beats.
Yeah, I tend to agree. There are a lot of people that would not pick up necessarily a climate change article, but they'll read an article about a local business, and then if woven in there is that, oh, that local business is a brewery that's having trouble growing their hops this year because of the drought, because of climate change, like you can kind of back into it and reach more people. Definitely agree.
I just want to add that we had a project a few years ago on the rivers of Tennessee that was done across the state. and it was looking at water quality, looking at the richness of our geography or topography, especially compared to other cities. I think, if I remember, Joel, we have more rivers per capita than any other state in the country. And so it was a powerful way to tell an environmental story without necessarily politicizing it, but just giving facts and resources why, whether you are someone who enjoys recreation or whether you are an environmental activist, why you all have this interest in preserving these resources.
Yeah, great. Well, so I just want to flag that we do have to wrap up at 40 minutes past the hour. So do you guys have any sort of final thoughts you want to leave our audience with, or final, I want to say recommendations, it's a lot of pressure, but any final thoughts on these issues and as it relates to your work in the media?
Well, I think you've hit a lot of really good topics. And I think that I certainly hope that people have benefited from that. Those are great ideas, especially to reach out to the news outlet with experts, with ideas. Just reach out to chat. That's how we learn a lot of things that way. And also, I would be remiss because I didn't say people who are interested in Knoxville and Knox County news can subscribe to our service. www.compassknox.com. So gotta get my ad in there one time.
Yeah, as I'm looking at the comments, I see one from Richard that says subscribe to your local newspaper, and I will echo that. If you want robust coverage of any topic and in-depth coverage, it's vital that you support local media, and we appreciate the fact that you're all on a call like this talking with local journalists, and appreciate the efforts that you're all making to be part of a wider conversation.
And I've left my contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out via Twitter or by email. There's been a question about the Tennessee Rivers Project, so I'm putting in a link here if you want to take a look at it to define what it is. And also, let us know what coverage ideas, what aren't we covering, what we need to go further. I mean, the Knoxville News Sentinel has done amazing work, especially on the coal ash cleanup over the last decade, and it's been riveting and tragic, but so important. Thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, David, Joel, Scott, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you for taking the time on a Saturday. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thanks for your great questions. This was part of my spiel too. I encourage people to subscribe to their local outlets and follow them on social media and keep up with this great local coverage. So now I think we will take a 5-minute break until the next session. Is that right, John? All right, we're taking a 5-minute break. We will see you back here, or you will make your way to another session at